You guys know how in the show The Office, the character Oscar is known as the well, actually guy? I'm just gonna be real upfront with you guys. I'm hardcore channeling my inner Oscar in this video. During scripting, I almost decided to tone things down, but then I thought to myself, I think everyone deserves to be the well, actually guy when they're talking about the thing they love and are passionate about, especially when they're protecting that thing from someone who's preaching that it's harmful. So in this video, you're going to get my real and raw opinion.
It is unprecedented, so it's cause for concern.
Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Taylor, and on this channel we talk about life and relationships after leaving the church and do some commentary on the goings-on in evangelical Christianity. Today I'm going to be responding to someone who I've never responded to before, and the only reason I even stumbled on his channel was because I was watching a bunch of ghost videos, as I do, and his video just happened to pop up. His name is Brian Holdsworth. He's a Catholic YouTuber and self-described apologist who makes videos about culture, morality, and religion through the lens of a conservative Catholic. This video of his that we'll be responding to today is titled "A Catholic Reacts to Ghost." He has quite an interesting reaction to Ghost, and the conclusions he comes to about the band, and specifically about the band's lead singer and founder Tobias Forge, are absolutely wild. So buckle up, guys, because this is going to be a bumpy ride. We'll be jumping into the video at about 7 minutes in, because for the first 7 minutes, Brian just plays his guitar for some reason. I think he's trying to give his audience the impression that he's familiar with heavier metal, which maybe he is, but whether or not he's familiar with the history of Satanism in metal remains to be seen.
So Ghost, if you're unfamiliar with them, are an emerging Swedish metal group, I think metal would be the word, descended from a long line of Scandinavian black metal. And the term black here is meant to denote like the sinister character or the persona that the band portrays in their lyrics, musical style, and stage presence. It's characterized by evil or a fixation on the demonic, or whatever personification of evil you can conceive of or that is meaningful to you. In the case of Ghost, though, they offer like a slight variation of the common fare that we would get from Scandinavian black metal, in that their music is catchier, it's more melodic, and you might even be able to say it's kind of fun. It's the kind of music you could dance to at times, which is actually what rock and roll was invented to provide for.
Okay, I already have several issues here. First of all, I wouldn't call Ghost an emerging band. They've been around since 2010, and even 2 years ago when Brian published this video, they would have been around for over a decade. Secondly, I don't agree with Brian's categorization of Ghost as black metal. I wouldn't go so far as to call him incorrect, mostly because I don't want to get into an argument over what truly defines a musical genre. Plus, Tobias, when he went as Special Ghoul when giving interviews prior to him being unmasked, he did say that the band is black metal in a traditional sense, but he's also said that they're not trying to be metal at all. So, musically though, Ghost is very far from black metal. While yes, the band's aesthetic and lyrical content has roots in black metal, when it comes to the characteristics of a particular genre, I think most people consider the sound of the band more than just the look of the band. Black metal uses heavily distorted guitars, has screeching vocals, and is very lo-fi. Ghost is almost the complete opposite of that. Black metal prides itself on being repulsive to the mainstream, while Ghost actively tries to attract a mainstream audience. All of this to say, I personally wouldn't call Ghost black metal, and I think that if you were to go around calling them that, most metalheads would probably laugh at you. We're already off to a bad start here, but before we continue, allow me a brief moment to thank the sponsor of today's video, Aura. Did you know that at this very moment, data brokers might be selling your personal information to scammers, spammers, or anyone else who may want to target you? Aura is an online security service that not only identifies which brokers are selling your personal information, but also automatically submits opt-out requests requests on your behalf to remove your info from these systems. This is especially important these days with all the data breaches happening. Recently, AT&T revealed that nearly all of their customers' call and text records had been exposed in a massive data breach. And it hasn't even been a few months since they admitted that over 70 million of their users' social security numbers ended up on the dark web. The stolen logs also contain a record of every number AT&T customers called or texted. So even if you don't use AT&T, if someone who texted you did, then your number has been exposed. Luckily, Aura has me covered on this. Using Aura's service, I discovered that 17 data brokers were selling my information. This knowledge definitely made me very uncomfy, but I'm relieved to know that Aura has already requested to remove my name from these online databases. This will help me reduce the number of pesky spam emails I receive and also protects me from hackers who could use my private info to access things like my social media or bank accounts. If you thought Aura was great already, your sign up also includes services like antivirus software, password management, VPN, parental controls, identity theft insurance, and much more. Actually, as soon as I finished creating my Aura account, I was immediately notified that one of my passwords was compromised in a leak, and I was able to get that quickly resolved. They really are the complete online security service, and I don't know about you, but I much prefer having all of this in one convenient location rather than having to have multiple apps. If you're interested in checking out Aura, and I highly suggest you do, you can use my link, aura.com/antibot, and receive a 2-week free trial. This link will also be down in the description. Thank you so much, Aura. Now back to the video.
And as someone who will probably always have some measure of appreciation for various forms of heavy music, I can say that I kind of enjoy their sound. It's original, it's complex enough not to be boring, it's well played, the band members are gifted musicians, and their stage presence is the kind of thing that it'll keep your attention at least. If I was an unthinking person, motivated purely by my passions, I would probably listen to them because I could easily find myself enjoying their music. But we aren't unthinking. Our intellect and our reason is what sets us apart from all other life that we know of. We are able to make judgments about actions, and we can even forecast the potential consequences and the effects of our choices. And that is why it is our intellect that should govern our choices, not our desires. If we were to rely merely on our desires, then we would be nothing more than mere animals.
Oh, the irony of calling yourself a thinking person and then going on to say something so unthinking. So, non-human animals do have the capacity to reason and understand cause and effect. They may not have the same level of cognition that we do, but to imply that animals completely lack this capacity is untrue. Also, there are a lot of non-human animals that are cooperative and make decisions for the good of the community rather than just based on their individual desires. I really don't want to get sidetracked on this because this is all pretty irrelevant to the conversation at hand, but I did just have to correct him on that. I also don't appreciate the subtle condescension here, as though Ghost fans are too simple-minded to truly understand what's going on with the band and that we're all just like wrapped up in our desires or something. I think Brian might want to rethink his thinking on this because...
So let me try to invite you to use your intellect to assess the role that a band like Ghost and the subculture that they perpetuate might have on you and on your life. So I've heard a few of their songs, and I have to admit that they're pretty hard to get out of my head once they're in, and I'm sure that there would be nothing more amusing to a band like Ghost to know that they have the ability to live rent-free inside a Catholic evangelist's head. Because if you're completely unaware of who they are and what they represent, they present themselves as a kind of mockery of Catholicism through their branding, their costumes, and their lyrics. And obviously, a Catholic like myself doesn't appreciate satanic lyrics repeating and rehearsing themselves in my head while I'm brushing my teeth. But of all the complaints I could make about Ghost, I'm sure many of their fans are prepared to respond in the same way that the architect of the group, who is lead singer Tobias Forge, would. He tends to arm himself with an attitude of levity, which is to say that when asked about the apparent against Satanism and the animosity he directs towards other groups. He says it's all just meant to be humorous and in good fun. It's trolling, really.
Okay. So, me being the huge ghost nerd that I am, I've watched and read a lot of interviews with Tobias, and I have yet to come across anything where Tobias says or even implies that what they're doing is just trolling. Yes, satire is part of what the band is doing. That's hard to deny. Ghost draws from Catholicism and inverts its image, structure, and doctrine. But to say that Tobias himself claims that it's all just about mockery and fun and nothing else, I think is completely unfounded. I think if Brian were more familiar with the band and their music, he'd know that their songs often deal with pretty heavy topics, from things like death to plagues to charismatic leaders and their lust for power. Just imagine that you're singing a song you wrote about Hypatia, the prominent woman philosopher that advocated for religious pluralism, and how she was killed by a mob of Christians over a political rivalry. Then this guy comes along and says, well, you're obviously just trolling because you said that this song is fun.
That's really sad.
I mean, this isn't I want to rock and roll all night with Satan. Like, there's also a serious message being delivered. Don't get me wrong, I like Kiss, and there is a place for music that's just about partying and having fun. It's just that Ghost isn't that. This isn't to say that there isn't a lighthearted and fun side to Ghost. There is, absolutely. This is especially apparent in their theatrics and the various characters and plot lines in Ghost lore. I mean, you really can't get much more silly than Cardinal Copia riding around the ministry on a tricycle.
Sorry about that, Papa.
The ministry is not your playground, Cardinal.
But I think what makes Ghost so special is that they're intentionally dynamic in their approach, balancing both levity and seriousness, as a lot of the best art does. As Tobias himself has said, they're a theatrical band with a social comment. I get the feeling that Brian is assuming that there's some sort of dichotomy here, as though it's impossible for a band to be both fun and serious at the same time. As for the apparent Satanism, I wonder what answers he's looking for from Tobias. Is he wanting some sort of admission from him regarding his relationship to Satan? We'll get to this as we continue watching, but at this point, I would ask my viewers to consider whether or not a piece of art is fully and always reflective of the artist's personal beliefs, or if it can stand alone.
If you get offended by someone who's trolling, well, it probably says more about you and your lack of humor than it does about the actual offensiveness of the troll, especially when it's just supposed to be for amusement and nothing else, really. That seems to be the line that they go with, and a lot of their fans seem to reproduce that kind of an excuse.
I'll concede that I have seen plenty of Ghost fans that claim that the band is just about mocking Christianity and that it's all just for a big laugh. While I think the listener's interpretation of a piece of music must be weighed against the artist's intent, I think that there's little reason to think that Ghost's music purely serves to mock the institution of Catholicism. Like I said, the mockery is there for sure, but there's a larger social comment that I think Tobias is trying to make. For me, I see Ghost as a commentary on mankind, how we deal with human suffering, how we find meaning and purpose, and the cycles we tend to fall into as a society.
And when further pressed whether they are themselves Satanists, Forge says that from a strictly Christian point of view, if that means believing in a physical, half-man, half-ram living in the underground, no, I don't believe such a thing exists. So there's this kind of casual dismissal of the whole satanic theme and lyricism, as if to say, you can't get offended by this because it's not serious, it's all just in jest. And of course, Christians, and especially Catholics, will get offended by it and naturally fall into this trap.
Okay, so this is a quote from Tobias, but he's leaving out part of it. Tobias was asked during an interview whether or not he's a Satanist. He said, from a strictly Christian point of view, if that means believing in a physical half-man, half-ram living in the underground, No, I don't believe there's such a thing. I'm not the opposite either. As far as I know, Tobias hasn't said that he's a Satanist. He's mentioned how in adolescence he was a Satanist, but I don't think he's claimed that label as an adult. Satan obviously holds a place of reverence in his life, but Tobias always clarifies that this Satan is the pop cultural Satan. This is an important distinction from the biblical Satan that Christians believe is evil.
For me personally, I think he or it, she, he, has been such a faithful companion for the majority of my life as a guide, as a mentor, as a symbol, that the idea of the devil representing evil as opposed to good does not, that clashes with my idea of the devil, because the devil for me represents rock and roll, film, freedom, humor, essentially my life, my background, because it's so colored with so many blasphemous expressions.
So when Tobias says that he doesn't believe in a half man, half ram living in the underground, but that he's not the opposite either, maybe this means there is a concept of Satan that he does believe in. But maybe this belief isn't the same type of belief that a conservative Catholic holds to. Maybe it's less of a proclamation about the truth of some supernatural reality and more of a sentiment that one finds comfort in, independent of any supernatural belief. So it kind of seems like to me that Brian sees Tobias as dismissive of the Satanism in Ghost's music because Tobias hasn't come out and said, yes, I'm a Satanist. The problem with claiming Satanism publicly is that this label means different things to different people. To a conservative Christian, a Satanist is someone who worships the literal devil. But to me, Satanism is a personal ritualistic practice centering on a figure I see as a symbol of independence and rebellion. To muddy the waters even further here, the pop cultural Satan that Tobias looks to for guidance might not be the same Satan that Papa sings about in Ghost. As we discussed in my video responding to Michael Knowles, I don't interpret the Satan and the Satanic Church and Ghost as necessarily good. So clearly the discussion on Satan, Satanism, Ghost, and Tobias Forge is a complex one. It's not the case that Tobias dismisses the Satanism and Ghost. He just addresses it in a nuanced way, which I think is something that Brian can't recognize.
But for the sake of consistency, if someone mocked another culture, even if it was meant to just be humorous, wouldn't most of us get offended by that? I like be really honest about this. I remember there was this comedian in the early 2000s named Jeff Dunham, who he did this ventriloquist act with a puppet who was supposed to portray like a Muslim terrorist corpse, which is to say that he was cherry-picking the worst parts of Islam and Islamic culture and making it the focal point of an act that was meant to mock Islamic culture. And honestly, when I saw that, I found it offensive, not only because it wasn't very funny, but I thought it was a cheap and degrading way to score points against a group who was already probably feeling really marginalized around that time period and also under heavy scrutiny for obvious reasons. But Dunham would dismiss his critics in what I think should be a familiar method. He would say, first of all, his character isn't actually a Muslim, and he says so in the act, even though he speaks with an Arabic accent, or what is supposed to sound like an Arabic accent, I think. He uses words like infidel, he wears a turban, and he claims to have worked for Osama bin Laden. So he avoids accountability for being objectively offensive by gaslighting, which, I don't know, I think that's kind of weak. If you want to truly criticize something that is worthy of criticism by your own assessment, I think that can be a noble thing. But when people react in a negative way, which they always will when you criticize something, you should have the fortitude to account for your actions and your words, or you never should have done so in the first place. On the question of Ghost, I would ask anyone who enjoys this kind of music, and specifically Ghost, Is it all just offered in as a fun and playful pastime? Or does he actually take it a little more seriously than that? When he mocks Catholic Christianity and sings about the devil, is it just trolling? Is it all just good humor? Or is he seriously directing animosity and what some might think is hatred towards a visible minority?
Oh my God, where do I even start with this? I agree with Brian that Jeff Dunham's Ahmed the Dead Terrorist was offensive and not funny. It's not analogous to what's going on with Ghost for many reasons. First of all, this analogy draws on a faulty premise. As we already discussed, Tobias has never claimed that Ghost is just about fun and mockery and nothing else, at least not from what I've seen. He's also never tried to argue that Ghost isn't a parody of the institution of Catholicism, and he's been upfront that he's not a fan of organized religion. Most importantly, Ahmed the Dead Terrorist was offensive because it effectively furthered pre-existing negative stereotypes about a marginalized group within an American context. Jeff Dunham, who's not Muslim and who enjoys a certain amount of privilege as a white man in America, was mocking a group that is underprivileged and already marginalized in the US. Tobias, on the other hand, grew up immersed in Christianity. He interacted with Christians in Sweden, where Christianity is the dominant religion. In the Western world, Christians have historically held significant political and social power. I'm sorry, Brian, but to imply that Catholics are a marginalized minority in this part of the world is an incredible demonstration of the Christian persecution complex. I also don't see how Tobias is cherry-picking the worst parts of Catholicism. Most Muslims agree that Islamic terrorists are religious extremists and don't represent the beliefs of most Muslims. Papa Emeritus isn't a parody of some fringe extremist, but is a parody of the institution of the papacy. Does Brian think that the papacy represents the worst parts of Catholicism? We'll talk more about this later, but it's important to point out that Ghost doesn't even mock any specific Catholic pope, but rather the institution of Catholicism and the papacy. It's not the case that they're targeting a group of people or a culture, like Brian implied. I think it's very important that we critically analyze the institutions of power that we uphold. No institution should be above scrutiny, and I think protecting a religious institution from this just paves the way for theocracy.
Well, let's consider some facts. The first one is something that not many of Ghost's true fans should be unfamiliar with, which is the fact that Tobias Forge is a Freemason. He belongs to a secret, esoteric society which has a colorful history of subversion and violence against Catholics and the Catholic Church. And if you doubt me when I say that, just look at the predominant role that Freemasons played in events like the French Revolution, the Spanish Revolution, and the Mexican Revolution, in which Catholics, clergy, and leaders were murdered on enormous scales.
It's true that Tobias is a Freemason. He belongs to the Swedish Order of Freemasons, which, interestingly, unlike most orders, requires initiates to be men of a Christian spirit. There's a huge emphasis in Freemasonry on tradition, so personally, I think this requirement has more to do with tradition than actual belief, especially considering Freemasons explicitly prohibit discussions on politics and religion in their lodges. But hey, maybe there's some form of Christianity that Tobias can get down with. I don't know as much about the other revolutions that he mentioned, but regarding the French Revolution, it is true that some clergy were killed. There was an overcorrection during the French Revolution, which is unfortunately a common trait of revolts, and some revolutionaries tried to de-Christianize France during the Reign of Terror. That being said, Brian is omitting some pretty important information here, namely why this revolution happened in the first place. Prior to the French Revolution, a large portion of France's population was impoverished, as job growth hadn't kept pace with the increasing population. There was also a major crop failure during this time, which just made things way worse. The monarchy was still a thing, and society was divided into 3 different categories: the nobility, the clergy, and the commoners. Commoners represented almost 98% of France, but held only 1/3 of the power in government. The nobility and the clergy were basically besties, so the commoners were almost always outvoted 2-1. Commoners also carried the burden of paying taxes and did virtually all of the manual labor, so there was a huge socioeconomic divide between most of France and the nobility and clergy. The upper echelons of the Catholic Church were comprised of mostly wealthy nobility. The church at this point had amassed vast amounts of wealth and land and was conveniently exempted from paying taxes, despite the fact that they held significant power in government. France was also on the brink of bankruptcy after a series of wars, and instead of taxing those who hoarded most of France's wealth, the country just placed higher taxes on the commoners. All of this was justified as God ordained. In other words, the poor were poor and the rich were rich because God chose them to be. Enlightenment thinkers, many of whom were Freemasons, began to deconstruct the idea that this structuring of society was God ordained. And Enlightenment thought played a crucial role in the subsequent uprising. Yes, the French Revolution was incredibly bloody, and I'm sure some Freemasons did kill clergy, but this revolution led to the fall of the monarchy and eventually to democracy and the separation of church and state. Of course, in the 21st century, we frown upon using violence to enact social or political change. But historically, those oppressed, when left without any other course of action, will use violence against their oppressors. To avoid such violence, it's important that we prevent any one group from holding a disproportionate amount of power and wealth. To me, it almost sounds like Brian is upset that the Catholic Church no longer holds the political and social power that they once did, which was the very thing that led to the revolutions in the first place. One last thought here before we move on. We should note that the Catholic Church has also killed people. I mean, do I need to bring up the Spanish Inquisition? So using Brian's own logic here, because he's a Catholic and hundreds of years ago the Catholic Church killed a bunch of people, that must mean that Brian's intentions are automatically nefarious.
So Forge had to endure certain trials of initiation to be inducted into a secret society which offers him connections to powerful and influential people. And to become a member, he would have had to, if his lodge is like other lodges, he would have had to swear a blood oath that if he were to ever reveal the secrets of Freemasonry, he should suffer a gruesome, mutilating death and dishonor to his remains. And there's no indication that high-ranking Freemasons take any of this ceremony, these oaths, or these rituals lightly.
If there's one thing that I've learned while researching for this video, it's that the Catholic Church hates the Freemasons. So Freemasonry isn't really as secretive as Brian's implying here. Mostly certain rituals and handshakes are kept secret, but information about Freemason lodges is publicly available. From what I've read, some lodges even allow non-members to join for certain lodge meetings. As to whether or not they take a blood oath, this might still be done, but not necessarily at all lodges. Something to understand about Freemasonry is that specific practices can vary from lodge to lodge while keeping to their core values of enlightenment and charity. Also, while many powerful people in history were Freemasons, George Washington is one example, that's not necessarily the case today, as their membership has greatly dwindled. But putting all of that aside, Brian is a Catholic. He believes that unless he pledges his life to Christ, he'll be sent to hell where he'll experience eternal torment. I personally think that eternal torment is worse than a gruesome death. Catholicism also leans heavily on ritual, so I don't understand why Brian looks down on ritual employed by Freemasons, but gives Catholicism a pass. And speaking of blood, Catholics believe in transubstantiation. They believe that when they take Holy Communion, the wine literally turns into Christ's blood. They're drinking and then pissing out Jesus. Just like Freemasons, if not more than Freemasons, Catholics don't take their faith lightly. So in my opinion, this is all just the pot calling the kettle black.
Forge even wrote a song about it for Ghost called The Square Hammer, with lyrics in the chorus commemorating that kind of initiation. And the level are, if you don't realize it, they're obvious Masonic symbols. It's basically a Freemasonic anthem affirming its connection, at least in Forge's mind, to Satanism and the occult.
Everybody loves Square Hammer, and for very good reason. The lyrics, "Are you on the square?" have even become a way for Ghost fans to cryptically signal their place in the Ghost fandom. The song does have multiple references to Masonry. The square in Freemasonry refers to their call to conduct themselves with honesty and integrity. The level refers to the idea that all members are on the same level and that there isn't a difference between a member who's a doctor from one who's a janitor. The Catholic Church promulgates the idea that Freemasons plot against them. Although Brian doesn't come right out and say it, there is some sentiment in the Catholic Church that Masons are real devil worshippers. Hey guys, Editing Taylor here. So I need to make a correction. The problem the Catholic Church has with Freemasonry has more to do with their belief that Freemasons practice naturalistic deism and not so much about alleged Satanism. Although I'm sure there are Catholics who think Freemasons are satanic, that's not the position of the church, and I don't want to imply that. Allegations of Satanism tend to come more from Protestants. Nonetheless, the belief that some Christians have that Freemasons worship the devil can be partly traced back to something called the Taxil hoax. The Taxil hoax was a hoax done by writer Leo Taxil in the 1890s. Basically, he pretended to convert to Catholicism and then spent over a decade writing about how the Freemasons participated in Satanism. His goal was to goof on both the Freemasons and Catholicism. And unfortunately, the church fell for it hook, line, and sinker. Taxil held a press conference and announced that the entire thing had been made up, but at that point, too many people bought into the conspiracy and most didn't believe him. He was astonished by this because he believed his claims of Satanism were too outlandish for anyone to really believe. But I think he discounted how readily people will believe something outlandish when it paints a group they already don't like in a negative light. The conspiracy that Freemasons are satanic lives on today, especially among more conspiratorial Christians. Jack Chick, the fundamentalist Protestant known for his Chick tracts, even published a tract called The Curse of Baphomet, where he tells this story of a young man who attempts to unalive himself after being cursed when his dad brought home items from his Masonic lodge. Chick cites the fictional work of Leo Taxil as proof for the claims of Satanism. It's actually banned in Catholicism for a Catholic to join the Freemasons. At one time, joining meant immediate excommunication from the church. Today, it's still considered sinful to join the Masons, and as recently as 2023, Pope Francis called it a grave sin and said that anyone who joins could be denied communion. Interestingly, Freemasonry doesn't have a rule against Catholics joining, so if we're talking about animosity, which group really holds the animosity here? One last thing before we move on, and I really appreciate you guys hanging in there while I channel my inner Oscar. I don't necessarily think that the song is a Freemason anthem. Like I mentioned in my video responding to Michael Knowles, there isn't one way to interpret any Ghost song. But you could interpret Square Hammer as kind of teasing the Freemasons. Since all Masons must affirm belief in a supreme being, in this song, Ghost could be asking of the Masons, well, what if that supreme being was Satan?
And in spite of what you might see on forums, or if you were ever to ask a Freemason, it's not a light-hearted affair. If it were, it wouldn't need to conduct its affairs in such extreme secrecy, and it wouldn't need to protect that extreme secrecy with something like a blood oath. And Forge, again, as many Ghost fans will know, hasn't gone without benefiting in important ways from his Masonic affiliation. When some of his former band members sued him when he fired them, the judge hearing the case sided with Forge. Now, it was later revealed that this same judge was a member of the exact same Masonic lodge as Forge. So it kind of turns out that those connections come in handy.
Alrighty, here's yet another instance where Brian omitted key information. Back in 2017, Tobias was sued by former members who alleged he withheld money from them. Tobias won the case, but the ex-members filed an appeal citing a conflict of interest as the judge was part of the same order of Freemasons as Tobias. However, the Court of Appeals upheld the ruling and said that there wasn't sufficient reason to believe a conflict of interest existed within the case. Apparently, the judge had never met Tobias. This was all detailed in a Revolver article back in 2019. If you Google ghost lawsuit, it's one of the first articles to pop up. Brian published this video only 2 years ago, so why did he only present half of the information about this court case? Could it be that Brian's simply cherry-picking information that will paint Ghost and Tobias in the worst light possible? I'll let you guys decide on that.
And in spite of the fact that Ghost and their fans will often treat what they're doing in sort of a lighthearted and trivial way, Forge has implied in interviews that his success can be traced to the devil himself. So even though he may claim that he doesn't believe in a cartoon character Satan, you can get the sense that he doesn't believe his satanic enthusiasm is inconsequential.
What stood out to me here is that Brian says that Tobias has implied that his success can be traced back to the devil. He doesn't say that Tobias said this verbatim. From all the interviews I've watched or read, I've never seen Tobias say this. As we discussed, Tobias does see the pop cultural devil as impactful on his life, and I'm sure he would say that this pop cultural Satan influenced his musicianship. But taking that and twisting it into Tobias attributes his success to the devil, I think is disingenuous. I'm also curious as to what concept of Satan Brian is talking about here. I get the feeling that he's talking about the concept of Satan that most Christians hold to, which is not the same Satan that Tobias sees as a mentor and companion.
When you listen to Forge discuss what it is that he's doing, the themes and the characters that he portrays, I would say it's obvious he's thinking of it in terms that go far beyond mere trolling. Like he's done interviews for Psychology Today, for example, in which he tries to offer a serious intellectual explanation for the whole initiative, which isn't the kind of thing that you do for a mere trifling comedic stage show.
Again, he's building most of his argument here on a faulty premise. Tobias has never said Ghost is just trolling and nothing else. It's like he's trying to frame Tobias as deceitful, and whether knowingly or unknowingly, he's fabricated this false reality to support this.
Furthermore, I would say that dismissing the devil by alluding to him in a way that he is depicted in old Bugs Bunny cartoons isn't really answering the question, because nobody believes in that characterization of the devil. As a firmly believing Catholic myself, I believe that the devil does exist, but the devil that Forge describes isn't one that I or any Christian believes in either.
So I'm not a Christian, so maybe I don't have a dog in this fight, but I do think it's rather presumptive of Brian to speak on behalf of all Christians. When I was talking to Drew while working on this video, he pointed out that his grandma specifically believed Satan was a spiritual and physical being that lived in the underground. When I was a Christian, I believed Satan was a spirit that often took physical form. I mean, Satan did physically appear to tempt Jesus in the desert. It's in your book, Brian. Tobias didn't write that. There are many, many concepts of Satan, and claiming that no Christians believe X, Y, and Z about the devil is just engaging in essentialism. He's effectively saying that the beliefs he holds to about the devil are the only correct ones, and anyone who has a differing view isn't a true Christian.
And I think that's an important detail, because when asked the question, Forge claims that he's going to describe the supposed Christian concept of the devil. Remember, he said, from a strictly Christian point of view, and then he describes that concept as a physical, half-man, half-ram, living in the underground. And not a single trait he just described is consistent with any Christian theology. Firstly, according to Christian theology, Lucifer, or Satan, is an angel by nature. That means that he's pure spirit, not physical. And since he's not physical, he can't have necessary physical traits like being a half man and a half ram, and he can't be said to be living physically in the underground, whatever that means. That's a textbook example of what it means to offer a straw man argument, which is a logical fallacy. It's when you recharacterize a position that is opposed to you, or that you are opposed to, in absurd terms, in this case, literally as a caricature, and then dismiss it for how absurd it is.
Okay, so first of all, in the book of Isaiah, Lucifer, the morning star, refers to the king of Babylon. Later, Christians connected the morning star mentioned in these verses to Satan, which is where we get the idea that Satan was a fallen angel. Fun fact, the Ghost song From the Pinnacle to the Pit heavily references these verses in Isaiah, but anyways, that's neither here nor there. Here's the thing, Tobias isn't putting forward any argument here. He was just asked in an interview whether or not he's a Satanist, and he replied, if that means believing in a half-man, half-ram living in the underground, then no. He's not putting forward an argument for a specific understanding of Satan within Christianity. Unfortunately, Brian didn't include Tobias's full answer to this question, but Tobias does go on to acknowledge that there are many ideas of what Satan and Satanism is. He's just saying if by Satanism you mean this, then no. I think Brian is really ignoring the spirit of what Tobias said and is instead honing in on specific wording in order to have like a gotcha moment. The problem with this is Tobias wasn't strawmanning because, like I said, there's no argument being put forward. If anything, Brian could have argued that Tobias misrepresented the common Christian understanding of Satan. But then again, Brian himself misrepresents other Christians when he presumes to speak on behalf of all of Christianity.
All of which is a clever rhetorical maneuver, maybe, but it's logically hollow and morally dishonest. Now, you could claim that, well, he's not at fault because he's not familiar with the nuances of Christian theology. But then you still have to confront the fact that he claims to expose the stupidity of Christian theology by explaining it to us. Remember, he said strictly from a Christian perspective or a Christian point of view, as if he's going to tell us what that point of view is. So he's presuming to be informed about something that he's clearly kind of ignorant of. Or he's just deliberately strawmanning a belief.
When did he claim to expose the stupidity of Christian theology? I mean, at this point, Brian is just straight up putting words into his mouth. Like I said, Tobias wasn't arguing for a specific understanding of Satan within Christianity. He was just answering an interview question. Like, it's really not that deep. I think that there's a big misconception here that Ghost is out to demolish Christianity. In my opinion, this couldn't be further from the truth. I don't think Tobias is trying to dismantle Christian theology. I think Ghost points out how corrupt people often use theology and religion as a means to control and gain power. Ghost is really a commentary on mankind, not necessarily on religion.
Either way, I think it's fair to say that it's a deceptive way to avoid facing his critics and accounting for his words and actions. Now, given the fact that he would take solemn oaths to join a secret society whose one of its chief aims is the subversion of a group of people, of a religion.
Okay, so the only way that Freemasons attempt to subvert Catholicism is by advocating for freedom of religion and separation of church and state. They're not trying to rid the world of Catholicism. They just don't think that the church should have like full power and control over entire countries. Bear in mind that those with significant privilege often feel they're under attack by the mere suggestion of leveling the playing field.
Given that he has made good use of his affiliation in Freemasonry with serious effect.
Okay, we already dealt with this. Nope, Tobias isn't unfairly benefiting by being a Freemason. The court upheld the ruling as fair.
And given that he does seem to think that his embracing of the devil has led to him becoming a successful musician, which is something that is an extravagant ambition for countless teenage boys with guitars around the world. I was one of them, I would know.
Again, I haven't found anything where Tobias specifically attributes his success to the devil. Something Brian might not be fully aware of is that Tobias grew up in the age of Satan and heavy metal music, horror movies, the Satanic Panic, and occult mania in pop culture. All of these things, without question, shaped the type of person he became and his musicianship. But Tobias would be a devil-liking kind of guy, whether or not he was successful with Ghost.
It seems to me that he takes this a lot more seriously than he's willing to admit to his fans. And that leaves me with a nagging question, which is, why isn't he willing to admit this to his fans? Why isn't he transparent about what he's doing as a vocational enterprise? Well, let me ask that question another way. What do you make of someone who invites you to participate in some community, some transaction, or some enterprise in which they have a certain intention that they conceal from those that they are appealing to? Let me give you an example. Let's say I'm trying to find people to invest in a pyramid scheme that I've invested in, and the only way for me to succeed and to make the amount of money that I want to make in it is by finding more suckers to invest themselves and to establish themselves at lower tiers within the pyramid. But I don't sell it to them like that. I tell them that this is a rare business opportunity, and it's an opportunity for them to attain financial freedom by being their own boss. So what I'm doing in that scenario is pursuing a particular intention, which is finding investors who will funnel money up to me in my position in the pyramid, while claiming to them that their participation has different intentions and benefits. That is a textbook example of manipulation. So when Tobias Forge presents himself and his band as a cultural manifestation grounded in lighthearted fun and trolling, when in fact he considers what he's doing to be quite serious and consequential, but you agree to participate based on the former notion in contrast to the real intention, how is that anything other than allowing yourself to be manipulated?
What? So Ghost is a pyramid scheme now? Lord, bear me strength. I feel like I'm uniquely positioned to respond to this because, as many of my longtime viewers would know, I used to make videos debunking claims from multi-level marketing companies, aka legalized pyramid schemes. First off, of course, his analogy here hinges on a false premise. I don't know how many times I have to say this, but Tobias, to my knowledge, never claimed that Ghost is just fun and games and nothing else. It's not like Tobias is telling his fans it's all just trolling and then turning around and doing things that would imply otherwise. Like, Brian was able to find articles where Tobias says that Satan plays an important role in his life. He's obviously not trying to hide this from his fans. Like, how does Brian think he was able to find these articles to begin with? So already this analogy fails, but for the sake of the argument, let's just grant that Tobias is scamming his fans. A pyramid scheme is a very specific kind of scam where participants earn money by recruiting others into the scheme. It's not just a simple bait and switch. If Tobias was operating Ghost in a pyramid scheme-like way, he would have to be personally recruiting people into the fandom, instructing those people to then recruit 3 more people, and then promising everyone a commission for anyone that they recruit. Like, come on, be so for real right now. Tobias isn't going door to door like, please sign up to be a Ghost fan so I can earn a pink Cadillac. He's just putting music out there, and if people like it, then great. If they don't, then oh well. He's not manipulating anyone or presenting Ghost as something it isn't.
And maybe you don't think so, but can we at least admit that to mock a community of people for their most sacredly held beliefs and cultural practices for profit is the very defining feature of everything we think of when we think of hate speech? If someone was to drape themselves in Jewish, Muslim, or Hindu stereotypes with the explicit purpose of mocking those people, I think we would see that for what it is. Characters like Apu from The Simpsons aren't even tolerated in the new ethical norms of society because it was a depiction of a Hindu by someone who wasn't Hindu for the purpose of comedic effect. In that case, it really wasn't meant to be serious. It really was meant to be lighthearted and trivial, but in that instance, it was considered unacceptable by society at large, and enough pressure was applied to put an end to it. In the case of Ghost, in spite of what is claimed, I don't think it is lighthearted teasing for comedic effect. It's something much more serious, grounded in what looks like true animosity for a community of people. And if you're someone who believes that hatred directed towards any group is wrong, then this surely fits that definition. And maybe you don't take it very seriously, as has been proposed to you, but maybe you should, given that those who invited you to participate in it seem to take it very seriously themselves.
So the conversation about what is hate speech and what isn't is very complex. And I'm not going to argue over a specific definition of hate speech, but I can confidently say that what Ghost is doing is not hate speech. I think an important distinction here is that Ghost is satirizing the institution of Catholicism and how this institution is used by those seeking power. He's not mocking Catholic people. The Ahmed the Dead Terrorist Act was offensive because it conflated extremists with mainstream Muslims at a time when many Americans already held a distorted view of Muslims. Apu from The Simpsons was offensive because it drew upon stereotypes at a time when there was little to no South Asian representation on American television. Like I said before, Tobias isn't mocking something that he's entirely separate from. And in the West, Catholicism has historically held significant power and wealth, as in vastly more than any other religion that has ever existed. This satire isn't being directed at an already marginalized group in America like Muslims or South Asians, but at one of the wealthiest religious institutions of all of human history. Satire is an important tool we use to flip narratives and conventions on their head in order to prompt change. Take satire away, and we run the risk of allowing powerful individuals and institutions to go unchecked, which always leads to further marginalization of those who are actually marginalized. It seems to me that much of Brian's argumentation here was based on the assertion that what Ghost is doing is just trolling. His arguments reminded me a lot of something I read in the book Speak of the Devil by Joseph Laycock. You guys know that we are huge Joe fans in this household. Joe spent years studying the Satanic Temple and non-theistic Satanism, and in his book, he goes over the history of TST and how they're changing the way we talk about religion. Joe remarks in the book that those with only a cursory knowledge of TST will often tell him that what they're doing is just trolling Christians. He goes on to say, "My suspicion is that this dismissive attitude goes beyond mere intellectual laziness and actually functions as a defense mechanism. It is a facile way of ducking the challenges that TST poses and preserving the two-tier model of religion described by Murphy, in which we do not have to think about Satanists. The two-tier model of religion refers to the attitude among scholars that new religious movements are less important to academic study than major world religions. Paradoxically, I think we dismiss TST because of, and not in spite of, the fact that they have something important to say. This leads me to wonder, was Brian's continued assertion in this video that Ghost just exists to troll and that its founder claims this himself really based on anything tangible? Or could it be the case that the mere thought of Ghost as trolls is so comforting to him that he unknowingly manufactured the entire idea himself? He's not happy about this. Thank you so much for watching, and a huge thank you to my patrons who help make these videos possible. If you like this video, please be sure to subscribe and ring the bell. If you'd like to follow me on social media, my Instagram is Taylor_the_antibot. And if you'd like to consider supporting this channel financially, a link to my Patreon will be down in the description, and we'll see you on the next one. Say bye.